Summer, 1945. The war in Europe was over. In a German orchard, behind coils of barbed wire, the air carried the sweet, buttery smell of roasting corn. 200 German women, the enemy, watched in silence. They were former secretaries and nurses, now prisoners in thin, worn-out clothes. They were supposed to be monsters. But when an American cook passed around the grilled cobs, something broke. They didn't speak. They just wept. One woman, her face streaked with soot, whispered, "This is the best meal I've ever had." They were the enemy, but a simple ear of corn would reveal a truth no one was ready to face. If you believe the most powerful stories are the ones we were never told, hit that subscribe button to help us unearth them. And let me know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. It's amazing to see where these forgotten histories land. The war was over, but the air hadn't gotten the message. It still hung heavy and gray over the Rhine, smelling of damp earth and rust. Near Remagen, in an orchard, where unripe apples dotted the branches like green fists, Sergeant Joe Tillman stood watching the wire. 200 German women, typists, clerks, nurses who had served the Luftwaffe were now prisoners of the U.S. Army. They moved behind the fence with a quiet, shuffling exhaustion that Joe understood better than he wanted to. He was 24, but he felt 100. The fighting had stopped, but the quiet that followed was just as loud. It echoed with the things he'd lost, mostly the sound of his brother's laugh, a memory now buried somewhere in the frozen mud of the Ardennes. Joe was a cook. His job was to turn tins of Spam and bags of powdered eggs into something that could keep a man moving. It wasn't a job of glory, but it was one of substance. You couldn't fight or march or even grieve on an empty stomach. His captain said his duty was to fuel the engine of the army. But Joe, a farm boy from Missouri, knew it was simpler than that. You fed people. That's what you did. It was a rule older than any army. One afternoon, while scouting the perimeter for anything useful, he found it. Tucked away near the tree line, forgotten by whoever had planted it, was a small, stubborn patch of field corn. The stalks were dry, the ears a little small, but it was real. It was something that had grown from the soil, not been stamped out of a factory. He ran a thumb over a kernel, feeling the smooth, hard promise of it. Back home, this was the smell of late summer, of county fairs and bonfires. It was the smell of peace. An idea, simple and direct, took root in his mind. It wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about morale, maybe his own. He spent the next hour building a makeshift grill over a shallow pit, using a bent piece of fencing for a grate. He shucked the corn, the dry husks whispering as he peeled them back. He found a forgotten tin of butter in the supply tent and a shaker of salt. Soon, a thin column of smoke curled into the German sky, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong in a prison camp. It was the smell of char and sweetness, of melting butter and toasted kernels. It was the smell of a backyard, of a home. The scent drifted across the wire, a ghost of a life no one had lived for years. On the other side, Greta Lindemann paused, her hands stilling from their task of mending a torn sleeve. She was 31. She had once been a secretary, her fingers flying across the keys of a typewriter, her world ordered by schedules and memos. Now, her world was this small patch of muddy ground. For weeks, food had been a thing of survival. Stale bread, thin soup, the metallic taste of chlorinated water. Fresh food was a memory so distant, it felt like a dream. She had lost her son in a hospital bombing in Berlin, a loss so vast it had hollowed her out, leaving only a quiet, aching emptiness. The smell of the corn was an assault. It was warm and real, and it clawed at that emptiness. The other women noticed it too. They gathered in small, silent clusters, their eyes fixed on the American cook. They whispered among themselves. What was he doing? Was it for the guards? Was it a trick? In their world, nothing was given without a price. Joe piled the roasted ears onto a metal tray. They were golden brown, flecked with black, glistening with butter. He walked toward the gate, the steam rising in front of his face. He didn't say a word. He just unlocked the gate, stepped inside, and held out the tray. The women stared, first at the corn, then at him. His face was unreadable, tired but calm. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't scowling either. He was just a man holding a tray of food. Slowly, one woman stepped forward and took an ear. Then another, then another. No one pushed, no one grabbed. They moved with a strange, solemn grace. When the tray reached Greta, she hesitated. Her gaze met Joe's. She saw no hate in his eyes. No pity either. Just a quiet offering. She took an ear of corn, its warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She took a bite. The sweetness exploded in her mouth. A wave of warmth and flavor, so intense it felt like a physical blow. It was the taste of the sun, of the earth. It was the taste of a world that wasn't gray. She closed her eyes, and for a split second, she wasn't a prisoner. She was just a woman eating corn on a summer day. Tears she didn't know she had left began to slide down her soot-stained cheeks, mixing with the butter and salt. She didn't sob. None of them did. They just cried quietly, their shoulders shaking as they ate. A woman next to her, a former nurse from Hamburg, let out a choked whisper. "This is the best meal I've ever had." Greta looked down at the simple ear of corn in her hand and knew it was true. Joe watched them, his throat tight. He went back for the rest of the corn and gave it to them, ignoring the protocol about extra rations. His lieutenant appeared at his shoulder, his voice low and sharp. "They're not your neighbors, Sergeant." Joe looked from the officer's crisp uniform to the women cradling the corn like it was treasure. He didn't answer. He just nodded. But in that moment, standing in a German orchard with the smell of smoke in the air, he realized the truth. The surrender papers had been signed. The guns had fallen silent. But this war wasn't over. It was just beginning. A week after the corn, a new presence arrived at the orchard camp. Her name was Elena Szabo, and she moved with the clipped efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation was a liability. She was with the Red Cross, a Hungarian interpreter sent to document the prisoners, to turn their lives into neat lines on a form. At 27, her face was a careful mask of professionalism, but her eyes held a weary ancient knowledge that belied her age. Elena was Jewish. She had survived Budapest by becoming invisible, by trading her identity for a set of forged papers and a uniform that offered a fragile shield. Her father had not been so lucky. He had vanished into the machinery of a labor camp, becoming another number, another ghost. For Elena, this assignment was a duty, not a mission of mercy. She saw two groups of people, the victors and the vanquished. She trusted neither. From the moment she arrived, she observed. She watched the American guards, loud and restless in their youth, their relief at the war's end making them careless. And she watched the German women, a sea of gray-clad figures who had served a monstrous cause. She felt no sympathy, only a cold, methodical need to do her job and move on. But then she noticed the cook, Sergeant Joe Tillman. He was different. He didn't talk much, but his actions were a quiet language of their own. She saw him ensuring the water pump was fixed, leaving a stack of clean cloths by the washing trough without being asked. She heard the whispers about the grilled corn, an act so bafflingly simple and human that it defied the logic of the camp. He treated the prisoners not with kindness, which could be a form of pity, but with a surprising, matter-of-fact restraint. He saw their need, and he met it. It was a detail that didn't fit her carefully constructed picture of the world, and it unsettled her. Elena set up her workspace in a corner of a large tent, a simple wooden table and 2 chairs her only tools. One by one, The women were brought to her. She worked through the list, her pen scratching across the paper, her questions precise. And then came Greta Lindemann, the woman from the corn incident. Greta sat with a ramrod straight posture, her hands folded in her lap. She was composed, reserved, answering Elena's questions in a low, steady voice. Name, date of birth, former posting. It was a sterile exchange, a transaction of facts. Elena felt the familiar wall between them, the one she relied on to keep her safe. But a detail on Greta's intake form caught her eye. Under next, of kin, only one name was listed, Carl Lindemann, with the word deceased written beside it. To complete the record, Elena had to ask. Your brother, she began, her tone neutral. Cause of death. Greta's composure flickered for the first time. Her gaze dropped to her hands. He was executed, she said, the words falling like stones into the quiet tent. By the Gestapo in February. Elena paused, her pen hovering over the paper. This was not the answer she expected. The system she served was built on clear lines of allegiance. A German executed by the Gestapo was a contradiction. On what grounds? She pressed, her professional curiosity now mixed with something else. Treason, Greta said, meeting Elena's eyes again. The word held no shame, only a profound sorrow. He was a school teacher. He was hiding Jewish families in the village. The air in the tent grew thin. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Hiding families. She knew that world. She knew the whispers in darkened hallways, the coded messages, the constant, gnawing fear. She had been a part of that world, a link in a chain that had helped a precious few, escape. Which village? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Greta told her. And then she spoke a name, the name of a family, a mother and two small children that Carl had sheltered in his attic for 6 months. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that name. After they had fled Carl's protection, she had been the one to guide them through the final checkpoint into Switzerland, her forged Red Cross credentials their only passport. The world, so vast and fractured, suddenly felt impossibly small. This woman, this enemy, was bound to her by a secret act of grace. The interview was over. The forms were forgotten. Elena looked at Greta, and for the first time, she did not see a German prisoner. She saw a woman hollowed out by the same grief that haunted her own nights. I knew them, Elena admitted, the words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. The family. I helped them. Greta's eyes filled with tears, the first Elena had seen her shed. He would be glad, she said softly. He made me promise, never to look away. She then confessed something else. Every night, she wrote a letter to Carl, telling him about her day, about the orchard, about the strange American cook who had given them corn. It was how she kept him alive. It was how she remembered that goodness had once existed and could exist again. Elena sat in stunned silence. The neat categories of her world, friend, enemy, victim, perpetrator had dissolved. There was only shared humanity, a tangled web of suffering and resistance. She had built her survival on looking away, on keeping a safe distance. But Greta's quiet dignity, and the ghost of a brother who had chosen otherwise, challenged everything. As Greta left the tent, Elena looked down at her hands. They were trembling. The wall she had built around her heart had begun to crumble. The fragile sense of normalcy that had settled over the orchard shattered 3 days later with the arrival of a dust-covered truck. It rumbled to a stop outside the main gate, and 2 American military policemen stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their movements devoid of the weary slouch of the regular guards. They were led by a lieutenant named Raymond Kessler, a man whose face seemed pressed into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. He carried a clipboard like a shield. The system had arrived, orderly and indifferent. Elena was in her tent, reviewing her notes on Greta, when she heard the commotion. She stepped outside, just as Lieutenant Kessler was handing a list to the camp commander. Joe, on his way back from the supply tent, stopped short, a feeling of cold dread coiling in his stomach. He'd seen this before, the neat lists, the sudden transfers. It never meant anything good. The camp commander called for an assembly. The women were lined up, their faces a mixture of fear and tired resignation. Kessler stepped forward, his voice flat and businesslike, and began to read a list of 5 names. 4 were unfamiliar to Joe. The 5th was Greta Lindemann. They were to be transferred immediately to a more secure holding facility further inland, under review for suspected high-level collaboration. The words hung in the air, a grotesque absurdity. Elena's professionalism snapped. She pushed through the guards, her Red Cross armband giving her just enough authority to be heard. "Lieutenant, there must be a mistake," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Greta Lindemann's brother was executed by the Gestapo for aiding the resistance. I have it in my official report." Kessler gave her a cursory glance, his eyes registering her as a bureaucratic inconvenience. "We have our intelligence, ma'am. The orders are from command. These women fit a specific profile." He was not a man who dealt in stories, only in profiles. He was a cog in a machine that had no capacity for nuance, no room for the truth of a man who died a hero. Fury, hot and sharp, rose in Joe's chest. He saw Greta standing perfectly still, her face pale but calm. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't arguing. She was simply accepting this next turn of the screw, as if she had expected it all along. That quiet dignity was more infuriating to Joe than any protest would have been. He felt the same helpless rage he'd felt when he heard about his brother, the feeling of a vast, unthinking force crushing something good for no reason at all. But this time, he couldn't just stand there. While Elena argued futilely with the lieutenant, Joe slipped away. An idea, a desperate, wild long shot had taken hold. Carl Lindemann. He was a local. Someone must have known him. Someone must have proof. He ran toward the village, his boots kicking up dust. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he had to find it. He asked the first person he saw, an old woman sweeping her stoop, who stared at him with blank, suspicious eyes and shook her head. He asked a man mending a fence who just grunted and turned his back. He was the enemy here too, a uniform they had learned to fear. Defeated, he was about to turn back when a small figure emerged from the shadows of an alley. It was a young boy, maybe 12 years old, with sharp, watchful eyes and bare feet. He had been a fixture around the orchard, a silent observer. "You are the corn soldier," the boy said in broken English. His name was Emil. Joe nodded, his heart pounding. "I need help. I'm looking for anything that belonged to Carl Lindemann, the schoolteacher." The boy studied him for a long moment, his gaze weighing Joe's sincerity. He had seen the American cook's small acts of decency. He had seen him treat the women prisoners not as objects, but as people. He made a decision. Without a word, he beckoned Joe to follow. He led him back to the edge of the orchard, to an old, gnarled pear tree whose roots buckled the earth. He pointed to a spot behind the trunk. "He told me," the boy whispered. "He gave me a coin." "Remember where this goes," he said. Joe fell to his knees and dug with his bare hands, the cool, damp soil clinging to his fingers. A few inches down, his hands hit wood. He pulled out a small, heavy box wrapped in oil-stained wax cloth. With trembling fingers, he pried it open. Inside, nestled in the dark, was a leather-bound diary. But there was more. Tucked between the pages were letters, thin and brittle, written in different hands. Letters of thanks from the families Carl had hidden, a list of names, a map of escape routes. It was all there. It was undeniable proof. It was truth, in a wooden box. A roar echoed from the camp, the sound of the truck's engine starting. Panic seized him. Joe scrambled to his feet, clutching the box to his chest, and ran. He sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at his face. He could see the camp now, see Elena standing by the gate, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The truck was already moving, lumbering onto the muddy road. He yelled, but his voice was lost in the engine's grind. He reached the road just as the truck rounded a bend, its canvas flap swaying. For a moment, he saw her face in the small opening at the back, calm, distant, already gone. The truck disappeared. The dust settled. The road was empty. Joe stood there, panting, the diary heavy in his hands. Elena and the boy came to stand beside him. The three of them stared at the empty space where the truck had been, the tangible proof of a woman's innocence, utterly, crushingly useless. The aftermath was a study in silence. The diary, once a symbol of hope, became a monument to their failure. Elena took it, of course. She filed a formal report attaching translations of Carl's entries and the desperate, grateful letters from the families he had saved. She sent it up the chain of command, a meticulously documented plea for justice sent into the maw of a bureaucracy that had already moved on. The system responded with a sterile acknowledgement of receipt. No promises, no updates, just a stamped form and the quiet hum of the machine resetting itself. The orchard camp felt hollowed out, the air thick with an unspoken sense of loss. Greta was gone, and with her, a fragile possibility had vanished. Weeks turned into a month. The unripe apples on the trees began to show a faint blush of red, oblivious to the human dramas played out beneath their branches. The orders finally came down. The camp was being dismantled. The remaining prisoners were moved to a larger, more permanent facility. Joe's unit received their own orders. They were going home. For the other soldiers, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They talked of steak dinners and baseball games and the girls they'd left behind. For Joe, the news landed with a dull thud. Home felt like a place he no longer knew how to find. He packed his gear, his movements slow and methodical. The grief for his brother now tangled with a new, formless ache for a wrong he couldn't right. On the last day, as the final trucks were being loaded, Elena found him by the empty corn patch. The stalks were brown and withered, rustling in the wind like old paper. They stood together for a moment without speaking, two people from different worlds who had briefly shared a common purpose. "You did a good thing, Sergeant," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. It wasn't an absolution, just a statement of fact. Joe just shook his head, unable to find the words. What good was it if it didn't change anything? He handed her a small, folded piece of paper with his family's address in Missouri. "If you ever hear anything," he said. It was the best he could do. The journey home was a blur. The rhythmic clatter of the train, the vast, heaving expanse of the Atlantic, the roar of a crowd in New York Harbor. It all felt distant, like a movie someone else was watching. Missouri was green and quiet, a world away from the gray mud of Germany. He went back to the farm, to the familiar rhythms of sunup and sundown. But the war had followed him home. It lived in the silences at the dinner table where his brother should have been, in the sudden, sharp scent of wood smoke that could transport him back to the orchard in an instant. Nothing felt resolved. It just felt over. Months passed. Elena, stationed in Geneva, continued her work. Her days filled with endless stacks of files. Each one a life distilled into a few cold facts. She had almost given up hope when a letter, forwarded through the labyrinthine channels of the Red Cross, landed on her desk. The postmark was from a detention camp in the British zone. The handwriting was neat and familiar. It was from Greta. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Greta was alive. She was well. The letter was short, but It held a world of meaning. She had never seen the diary, never heard the outcome of Elena's report. But she had heard, through whispers and rumors that traveled between camps like seeds on the wind, what the American cook and the Hungarian interpreter had tried to do for her. She wrote not of her own hardship, but of her gratitude for their attempt. Tucked inside the letter, carefully folded, was a single, dried corn husk leaf, still faintly stained with butter. "I still remember," she wrote. "That meal reminded me that the world can be kind again. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Please don't stop feeding people, especially when you're told not to." Elena read the letter 3 times. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, finally, completely, giving way to tears. She found the scrap of paper Joe had given her and forwarded a copy of Greta's letter to the small farm in Missouri. Years melted into decades. The world healed, scarred but whole. Joe grew older. He married, had children, and then grandchildren. The farm prospered. One late summer evening, he was out by the barn, grilling corn for his young grandson. The smell, rich and sweet, filled the air. His grandson, his face lit by the orange glow of the fire, asked him about the war, a subject Joe rarely spoke of. Joe looked at the boy's innocent, curious face, and for the first time, he told the story. Not the story of battles and enemies, but the story of an orchard, and of hungry women, and of a meal that had cost nothing and had been worth everything. He told him about Greta, and Elena, and the boy named Emil. He told him about the diary they had found too late. "So you failed?" his grandson asked, his small brow furrowed with concern. Joe smiled, a slow, sad, and beautiful thing. He handed a perfectly roasted ear of corn to the boy. "No," he said, his voice thick with a memory that had never faded. "We didn't fail." He looked out over the fields of his peaceful, quiet home. Sometimes, the smallest kindness becomes the biggest thing someone remembers. And sometimes, that's enough.